Gear readings, this is Craddock. Over the holidays and into the beginning of the year here, I've been working on preparing mini builds that I might use in season. For many different classes, we have, Wizard, Necromancer, Demon Hunter, Crusader here. So I wanted to both give you this access to the spreadsheet so you can possibly use all these builds, and I wanted to prepare it in this manner such that I can replace any of the builds as needed. In the future, as you can see here on the right side, I will fill in Diablo fans links as I feel, if I feel I want to create a written document for each build. And there are also video links, and if there's a post related to any build, it will be in the right column as well, so you can see it there. Very nice. So we're going to start in this video. We're going to be covering the Wizard. So Wizard is always pretty much my favorite class in Diablo, and I might even start Wizard next season. So definitely looking forward to what Wizard can offer next season. And these are pretty much the builds I'm most interested in, or I might am most likely to play. So we're going to go over those. A general overview type, I'm going to try and move fairly quickly. This portion, the first portion of the video, we'll be going over the Nephilim Rifting and Torment 13 Bounty builds, and then we'll be going into the Greater Rifting and Greater Rift Pushing builds later on. So starting at the top here, you'll see I have the Vyr starter build. If you haven't seen the video for this one, I highly recommend watching it. Very, very neat setup indeed. I list both the starter setup with what you should cube and then just plain yellows, and then I go into an alternate setup that you could use if you have the edge schedule. Of course, if you want to see more about this, watch that video. We have the Frozen Orb Sage build. So this is a Tal Rasha's build that can fit in the Sage's set. Sage's set gives you an extra Death's Breath drop every time you kill an elite pack, which is very, very juicy indeed. Definitely something, if you can fit it in efficiently in a build, you should try and look for that, just because you get more materials that you can use to craft more gear, etc., etc. So this particular build is fairly heavily, you're going to want to gear for both attack speed and resource cost reduction in particular. Going to want to look for resource cost reduction as well. Topaz in the helm, resource on the shoulders, and such. So a lot of recovery from Astral Presence and Arcanaut, just trying to keep up with having the Aether Walker spending a lot of arcane power on top of the arcane orbs going out. To balance that resource, though, we also have the Shaman Elseer. So you'll be stunning enemies with Calamity, but also recovering a lot of arcane power whenever you send out piercing orbs. Very high proc coefficient signature should return a lot of arcane power via arcane power on crit, of course. Can opt for extra resource here instead of arcane orb damage if you really want to, but in general this will be pretty much a mainstay, and it's one of the most efficient wizard builds at both clearing early season and farming extra gear. The Grandeur bonus I've chosen for this particular build was to swap out the Ring of Royal Grandeur and slot a different ring, and I've chosen just a Stone of Jordan. And Stone of Jordan doesn't seem like that much of a benefit here, but it is going to help out. The extra, there's a little bit of trade-off here with losing some of the crit and crit hit damage, but overall I think it will be a benefit. The extra elite damage here will be quite nice to help destroy those elite packs and then move on ever so quickly, right? Anyways, very cool build, very efficient in season if you can get it put together early on. Lot of synergy here with the Avarice Band and the Boon of the Hoarder, giving you that nice gold gain in season. So you see this is a theme. I'm going to try and fit in the Avarice Band and the Boon of the Hoarder along with secondary gold find on gear, just so you don't have to do as many Greed's Realm in season. So the next build we have on our list is going to be the Frozen Orb Bounty build, very similar to the setup we just saw with the Sages, except we're swapping a lot of items out. Since this isn't a Nephilim Rifting variation of the Frozen Orb build, you're going to swap in more resource. You're not engaging as often with enemies. You're traveling more often in a bounty build, and you also might require more damage. So we're going to swap in the Focus and Restraint, the Bastions of Will set for getting that extra multiplier. We're also going to wear the Halo of Carini. We're going to drop both Stone of Jordan and the Avarice Bands, which you don't really need. You might gear a little bit of pickup on your gear, but generally you won't have to pick up orbs or gold in this build, so we're just going for... I've opted for the Molten Wildebeest Gizzard. You could go Bane of the Powerful here, but I felt that the Bane of the Powerful, with the increase that Tal Rasha's is going to get next season, it says 3,000 here, but it's actually 2,000 per stack, so 8,000 total increase at 4 stacks is going to be how high it goes. That's still a significant increase above what it is currently on live. So I feel you don't necessarily need the Bane of the Powerful, and proccing that bonus was kind of difficult anyway. In the bounty build, you'd have to go out of your way to kill an entire elite pack many times on many occasions, so kind of felt like a drag. With the Molten Wildebeest Gizzard here, it just gives that extra layer of recovery and shielding, which actually does help out in this build. We are running the Pride's Fall, which if you get hit, you lose that resource cost reduction, huge amount here. So we're running the Galvanizing Ward for the extra shields. In combination, when you teleport, you're gonna proc your deflection stacks. When you attack, you're gonna proc your deflection stacks, stack up more shielding. In combination with the Ashnagar's Blood Bracer, this should provide a nice, beefy extra layer of defense that it's going to protect you both from losing resource and from dying, right? So the cool thing here is with the Grandeur bonus on this build, I've swapped in the Halo of Carini, whereas before I had to run the Ring of Royal Grandeur and basically energy armor, which, as you can imagine, was not as defensive as Carini can be. Even though we're flying through the rifts, I feel that being able to place Power of the Storm for more cost reduction here is hugely beneficial, and the Carini, of course, when your Storm Armor, when you have to stop and attack enemies, your Carini will go up and then protect you. So that's the idea anyway with this build. A lot of utility with homing pads, etc., etc. So very cool setup indeed. The next build here we have is the Lightning Meteor Sage build. So this build is also including the Sages set. This is a Torment 13 build. And all of these builds thus far have been hybrid builds, meaning you could do them solo. But the bounty build specifically, I've sort of designed around groups, so I may change that label. But you can take these either as solo or in group, which is amazing. The Lightning Meteor Sage build here is quite unique because we use the Rancelor's Bracer to, because the attack of Meteor, Lightning Meteor in particular, is so small, the radius of it is so small, we want to pull enemies closer, and we're going to do that with the Rancelor's Folly Bracers, kind of pulling the trash in on top of the elites that we're engaging, and just grouping everything up and dispensing with them so much better, which is going to be pretty nifty. The cool thing here is you do have room for the Sages. You have to wear the Sages set as the gloves and the helmet, though. You cannot replace the boot slot because we want to wear the Nilfr's Boast, right? Yeah, and we're using Pain Enhancer here in that middle gem slot. This is because we want to increase our attack speed, give that nice burst of attack speed before we lay into our Meteor cast. This is a manual cast Meteor build, so what you're going to do to engage is you're going to teleport on top of enemies. Calamity will hopefully proc your Pain Enhancer crit and proc your Pain Enhancer stacks. On top of that, you'll then cast the Energy Twister, which should tick once or twice, giving you an additional chance to get even more Pain Enhancer stacks. And then that's when you just dispense with your enemies. You just unload a ton of quick Thunder Crash Meteor casts on top of them and just destroy them. The visuals with this build are also amazing. When you explode enemies, it will create like large lightning, they're not really clouds, but discharges into the graphics are amazing. So I love playing this build. Has the Avarice Band, of course. We're running the Stone of Jordan, and then for the seasonal bonus, I chose the Halo of Carini. Going to be a huge benefit here, both for resource and because we get to use Power of the Storm, and then additional defense with this build. It's going to be a very nice setup. Hopefully comparable to the Frozen Orb setup in season, and this is one I definitely want to try out next season because I've run Frozen Orb into the ground. I've played it before, and the other thing here that kind of attracts me more to Meteor this season is that this build doesn't require you to maintain stacks as the Frozen Orb build does with Triumvirate, which is kind of a little bit annoying at times. This build, on the other hand, is still resource stable, but you don't have to worry about that. So that's really appealing to me, and I'm going to definitely be checking this build out next season. We have here the Infinite Blast build, which is basically an explosive blast, Tal Rasha's build. I chose to not run Sages in this variation. I just love the movement speed with this particular build. I just can't see the advantage of Sages, considering it's a little bit more difficult for a non-Archon base to get around and seek out those elites. I just feel like the movement speed and the free movement that the illusory boots here kind of help out with just assists you finding those elites more, which just makes the build work all the much better. But as you can see here, you've got Wreath of Lightning, Krelms, you've got Illusionist, the movement speed from Boon of the Hoarder, of course. So the Warzekian Arm Guards being procced by the Wreath of Lightning, additional synergy there. So there's a lot of synergy here. Defense provided by Orb of Depth, which should be easy enough to hit enemies with your Explosive Blast, considering that's the main playstyle. Helping us to lower our cooldowns. The cool interaction here with Ingeom is that you get to your resources provided through Prism, so you just keep all three of these skills on autocast: Frost Nova, Explosive Blast, and Diamond Skin. Frost Nova providing the Bone Chill, so as you freeze enemies, you will get more damage against them. That said, with I did feel like keeping the Focus and Restraint, the Bastions of Will, with this build because EB has like a slightly lower multiplier as compared to, say, the Meteor-based builds, so kind of felt like keeping it in there just so it would be a little bit more balanced offensively. But resource-wise, this should be okay as well, but you may be able to swap offensively. You may be able to swap out the Bone Chill. That's why I provided some alternate configurations that, you fill in extra movement speed with the Scramble Rune. You can fill it in with extra shielding from the deflection stacks, etc., right? So very, very cool setup here indeed for rifting. Very engaging, very fun. And the bonus this season, very cool. You can swap in the Avarice Band in the extra slot here. I used to run Gloves of Worship with this setup. I dropped Gloves of Worship. Slotting Nemesis braces is just more convenient, so that's what we're running here. Alright, and moving on, we now have the Vyr Cold build that I've been working on, and I'll put a full guide out on this one, so you'll be able to reference that on the spreadsheet as well. But the general idea here with the Vyr build is that you are stacking up Vyr 6 stacks, both from Archon kills and from hitting enemies, giving you both damage and defense, scaling up, of course. And then the way we deal damage in this build is through both Chantoto's Will and a combination with the Miranite Gem. So proc based in this regard is kind of nice. The freedom from Aetherwalker is amazing with this build. You don't have to gear quite as high cooldown because it doesn't require super high cooldown, right? We actually want a gap in time to be able to attack enemies with this build, so we can stack up the Chantotos before expending it, right? So that's the general idea here, is that we've just got a quite high cooldown, but not perfectly high, so that we can instantly reset Archon, and then the Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac coming in to help us reset Archon. So that's probably the only downside with this build, is the reliance on the Zodiac. But other than that, I've been testing it for a few days now, and it's just amazing. It feels amazing to play. So my recommendation thus far has been, if you are looking to be as efficient as possible at the beginning of the season, you're definitely going to want to seek out a build that can include the Sages set. That way you can get as much gear as possible early in the season. But if you want to continue on with the Vyr set, considering Season 16 Vyr is the starter set for Wizard, you can go with this build and have a lot of fun. It is an engaging build. It is definitely not a lazy build. You can include, while you can't include Sages with this build, there is a variation that does include the Broken Crown, so there is some advantage to going this route instead if you want to opt that. Anyway, that's the summary for the Nephilim Rifting and Bounty builds. I don't have quite a lot of Bounty builds as yet. I may include a Bounty build on Meteor in the future, but for the time being, this Frozen Ore Bounty build has met my needs, and I love it. So, yep. Alright, so moving on to the Grandeur of Speed builds for Wizard. These builds are going to be used for XP farming, gem leveling, all sorts of looking for legendary items. You can typically find a lot of legendary items from running Grandeur of Speeds, so the neat thing this season is with the Tal builds. We're going to start off here with the Tal Meteor Speed build, getting a huge increase in damage from the set bonus, going up to about I was running Grandeur of 109 at a 4 to 6 minute pace on the PTR, but that was before the decrease down from 3000% to 2000% per stack. So I would expect somewhere in the range of 107 at the same gear level as that video. So but it's still 110 capable once you gear and fully augment it, put a lot of Paragon into it. It can do 110 speed solo, right? So definitely a very strong build indeed. One of the slower moving builds, because you can't really fit the Aetherwalker into the setup, both via resource and via the weapon slots are all taken up, right? But it is going to be huge advantage to maybe at least put this together in season for running those, maybe getting those higher gems up if you were solo especially. But cool thing here is, because a lot of the Tal builds were using, these speed builds were using the Unity ring. With the Grandeur bonus, we can now swap the Unity out for the Endless Walk and gain up to 50% DR, or when you are standing still, you could get up to double damage, which has increased the capability of these builds significantly, which is amazing. It's amazing. It's going to be amazing to run Tal speeds next season. So this is probably one of the slower moving, but also the strongest build. So yeah, we're running Meteor, channeled Meteor with the Etch Sigil. You're going to want to manually cast Meteor every 3 seconds or so. Withhold that on the Rift Guardian probably. We are running the Aquila Cuirass for extra defense, an extra layer of defense. So you kind of want to keep an eye on that. Make sure you don't dip below too much resource, don't expend too much resource. We're going to run a resource roll in the shoulder, and of course you can swap out the Amethyst and the Helmet for a Topaz if you want that extra resource buffer. I typically do that sometimes. I do it sometimes. Cool thing here is we're running the Invigorating Gemstone, so it's an interesting choice, and a lot of players might think that Bane of the Powerful is the better option here, but in my experience, Bane of the Powerful compared to Invigorating Gemstone, they compare about the same. in my opinion, because you're getting the extra healing here, but more importantly, you're getting immunity from crowd controlling impairing effects, which in turn increases your average damage, because if you're getting CC'd, stunned, feared, knocked back, that's time that's not spent DPSing, where you could have been DPSing, right? So dealing the damage and channeling. And that's because the Deathwish requires you to channel. Same thing with the Etch Sigil. So these multipliers don't go into effect unless you're channeling with your ability. I've opted here for a static discharge variant, running the Frost Nova Frozen Mist on cooldown. Basically just put this on autocast. It's just easier to play in my opinion. And yeah, it's a very fluid setup, very tanky, and should be able to get you very high GRs. If your group is running an effect that would give you immunity to crowd control impairing effects, I would advise, yes, swap out the Invigorating Gemstone. Definitely go for something like Bane of the Powerful that might give you more damage, more toughness in the Rift. So now here we have the Frozen Orb. So this is going to be a Frozen Orb variant. It's not going to perform quite as well. You'll probably be able to get up to about 100, so this is the range I'm recommending, about 85 to 100, which is significantly less than, significantly lower than the Meteor build, but you have to consider that Frozen Orb is really fast. It's one of our fastest clearing builds, which is amazing. So this build can clear somewhere in the range of maybe 2 to 3.5 minutes. It's insanely fast clear. So if you're looking for quick gem ups at still a fairly high greater rift to get experience with, this is the build that you're going to want to pick, right? I've opted for the Endless Walk here in combination. I kept the Unity because this particular build can fit in the Aetherwalker, unlike the other build, right? So high mobility here with the Aetherwalker. You can zip through those rifts, pulling in enemies with the Black Hole, and then exploding those elites, right, with the Frozen Orb. Explosions, Unstable Scepter, Triumvirate combination here. You're going to want to just be mindful of the Endless Walk bonus. You can transition it as you want to more defense or more damage, but typically you're going to want to not want to run around so much. It seems contra here, my choice of going Illusionist, but I kind of felt that if you have to move around, you're going to want to move around quickly, right? Your run speed, your movement speed is going to want to be higher, right? So I felt like using the Endless Walk more efficiently, this is still a great choice, and still a great choice to get through the Rift, right? It's just be more mindful of keeping more still when you're doing your teleport through the Rift if you want to maintain that multiplier. Overall, this felt like the best method to gain a higher GR while still going very quick. Now, if you just want those, if you're going for like a slightly lower GR, maybe 5 GRs lower, definitely go Focus on Restraint and then pop in maybe an Esoteric to balance out that defense. You'll notice here, this particular build, we are running the Firebird's 2-piece to get that extra. The double revive is quite nice with this build, especially since there isn't as much, we don't have the Aquila, you know, you just don't have as much base defense as the Meteor build or even the Explosive Blast build. It can fit in, right? So very, very cool indeed. Both of these setups. This particular one uses the Witching Hour, as you can see, so definitely try those out. Both of them worked out very well, in my opinion. The next build we're going to look at is the Explosive Blast. So this one performs about the same level as the Frozen Orb can, but it's a much slower. So this is going to be similar to the Meteor build. It's more of a 4 to 6 minute clear, but at that lower Greater Rift potential. This is mostly due to the lower multiplier on the Wand of Woe. But yeah, you're running the Deathwish here, so it's also a channeled build with the Etch Sigil, casting those extra explosive blasts. But the cool thing here is we have the Black Hole, so it's nice pull effect coming out, and this will be automatically cast by your Etch Sigil. Don't forget at the beginning of the Rift to cast it at least once. We are sacrificing a little bit of defense here because we won't have all 4 stacks from the 4-set bonus up within the Rift, so I do recommend going the Esoteric Alteration in this configuration. You will have quite high uptime on your diamond skin, which should protect you as well, but it's not perfectly, aligned, so that's why I recommend going the defensive gem here. Felt like the best means to balance defense. Of course, you can modify this if you want, but that's just how I felt, at least in solo, was fairly required to be able to engage enemies, get in the thick of them. You're very up close and personal with this build, despite having both the Power of the Storm and the Halo of Carini equipped. You were up close and personal. Something on the Rift Guardian, if it is a single target Rift Guardian, be mindful of your Halo of Carini. You might have to teleport out and then run back in, or vice versa, to be able to keep up your defensive bonus. So the illusory boots in this build make it very fluid. You can position at will. Very, very nice. Very, very nice setup for those nicely positioned explosive blast casts. You are going to go for area damage in this build because area damage doesn't really work with the extra casts from the Edge Sigil with the explosive blast, but or the Wand of Woe cat blasts, if I remember correctly, but still very powerful. And this build does use the Aquila as well, so it's a tanky, should be fairly tanky as well. It's a fun option to go with in season. Then here we have this other build. We've got the DMO Frozen Orb Speed. So similar to the Tal Frozen Orb Speed, this is also an Aetherwalker based variant. I wanted to include the DMO build though, because it is the strongest performing DMO speed variant that I've run to date. It does use both the Unity, double Unity, and the Halo of Carini, so it's more of a solo variation, but you can do a lot with this build, especially with DMO getting more than doubled next season. Should be pushing similar, almost a 100 speed GR. What I've done for the Grandeur bonus here is I've opted for the Leoric's Crown for more resource cost reduction. What this allows you to do is swap in the Unwavering Will passive, which will be really nice for taking out elites. Yeah, I was running this build a couple of seasons ago, running very fluid 94, 95 greater rifts so at the end of season. So this build in particular, you're going to want, I forgot to mention, both Frozen Orb variants. You're going to want to seek out both area damage and attack speed are going to be very nice to slot if you can manage it, right? So, and yeah. Alright, so let's move on to push builds. This is the Tal Meteor Shower push build for next season. Going to be one of the highest pushing, easiest to gear, easiest to push, and still a ton of fun. It's going to be an amazing build to try out next season and just ease into those higher greater risks with, especially. Neat thing here is we are running the Endless Walk now. Dropped the Unity, the double Unity, so the 50% damage reduction we would be getting from that item is no longer there, so you have to keep that in mind when you're going through these greater risks. To that end, I've tried to balance the defense of the setup by both swapping out affixes on gear, and also I've placed Blur in the 4th passive slot. I feel like this would be something you could do to try and push higher, since the build itself doesn't really, it recovers well from dying, I would say, as compared to maybe an Archon setup, which would not recover well from dying and would favor a second life proc, like Unstable Anomaly, for example. I feel we can swap that out for the defense from Blur here, and then just place more vitality on gear, so you're going to want to get Vite on, bracers, offhand, weapon, gloves, anywhere and everywhere you can, right? And then similar here, we're running the resource on shoulder to sort of balance that resource a little bit. APOC, Arcane Power on crit on the source in combination with the static discharge. We're running a lot of shielding here from the blood bracers in combination. This will double the potency of our shields in combination with a very high health pool. This will be very good because the shield abilities are based on % life. Galvanizing Ward resets every 5 seconds. The deflection will stack on top of that and give us a nice recurring as we're attacking enemies and moving through the rift. Teleport will proc deflection as well, so that's kind of a little added bonus just to keep it up while you're in motion. But this will give a nice buffer in the rift. Just remember the Halo of Carini. Make sure that you have at least some enemies at range so that the storm armor can hit them. We are running Power of the Storm for resource, and then I've chosen to run the Frozen Mist setup. I do prefer balancing my Edge Sigil around the breakpoints for the Arcane Torrent as opposed to Ray of Frost. So to that end, I've recommended, with this particular setup, you're going to want 1.53 to 1.64 attacks per second on sheet, which is basically roll off the attack speed from the Tal's chest, and then you're good, right? You just put the extra points into Paragon, and that's it. If you are instead running a dual channeling setup, that also works very well. But if you want to have Ray of Frost as your primary channel, you will have to adjust the attack speed, and I think it's something like 6.6 is the preferred attack speed that you're going to want to be at, about 1.49, just below 1.5 basically, to be able to hit that breakpoint with Ray of Frost. This is because Ray of Frost is a speed coefficient of 2, whereas the Arcane Torrent is a speed coefficient of 3. And this will allow you to cast your Edge Sigil as frequently as possible, as close to 1 second as possible. Every time it procs, it will proc as close to that interval as possible, which is what we want. Now this particular build does run the Aquila Cuirass. That's why resource is so important. We're running Trapped, Taeguk, and Stricken for the Rift Guardian. This is the best third gem. There we are, and we are running Illusionist to reset teleport, mobility, etc. Calamity for the stun. And yeah, it's a very, very smooth setup for Greater Rift pushing. There are a lot of acceptable mob types, acceptable maps, very convenient pushing setup indeed. Especially earlier in season, it's just very smooth. And this was as high as I could get the defense without giving up the endless walk. If you wanted to push higher, you could try something like Unwavering Will and Elemental Exposure. Those might be very good. Just remember, with the Elemental Exposure, you will have to roll an element on your weapon, such as Cold. It doesn't have to necessarily be Cold, but that's probably the best element. Defensive, you could just go back to running Unity and then the Endless Walk, of course. This would also be a very solid setup, much more defensive as you can see here. So other configurations here. This is a setup that I pushed with a couple of seasons ago and quite enjoyed. I actually use this for hardcore. I was pushing this configuration on hardcore, which was quite nice indeed. The only difference here, I've swapped out the Unity, so it wouldn't be as viable for hardcore without the Unity, but we're now running Endless Walk. The Crowns are very good, in my opinion, at limiting RNG. Every time you get vortexed or knocked back, this helps out with those mob types. Those elites that would have those affixes are kind of nullified, which makes it a lot easier to push. So even though you don't have the double shields, you do have this, and then you get the extra second life, and you still have blur. So it's a very smooth setup as well. So if you're looking for an easy push setup, this is definitely something I would look into. And then you could possibly, there's potential here to go area damage if you want, even though the Etch Sigil doesn't, the meteors from the Etch Sigil casts aren't going to be proccing area damage. Your manual meteor casts are. And I am going to advise with this build that you cast meteor about once every 3 seconds or so, manually in between. So you're holding down the channel and then you manually cast the meteor in between, right? And this is just to make sure that you're using it as efficiently as possible, get more meteors in per rotation. The reason I don't recommend manually casting more is twofold. You don't want to expend too much resource on accident and drop your Aquila bonus, but you also want to make sure that you're not, the more you manually cast the meteor, the less you're actually channeling, and you get a lot of multiplier from the Deathwish and the Etched Sigil. So it's meant to ensure that you're channeling, because the meteor has a delay and the volley of 7 meteors lands over a spread of time. If you cast more than that, I feel like it's a damage loss. The only exception to this, at least from my perspective, is the Convention of Elements. So you can try and fit in multiple meteor casts if you want for the Convention of Elements. How I do it is I just cast manual meteor before the fire comes around. Hopefully that lands almost immediately, and then I cast it pretty much as soon as possible just to get that second manual meteor cast in before the fire rotation ends. That's how I try to do it anyway. And area damage is most likely best fit in here for the shoulder piece and the weapon, in my opinion. So if you're looking to run a little bit of extra area damage, that's something you can fit in. Average damage here on the rings is recommended because of how Etched Sigil doesn't work really well with area damage. So yeah, it's just a very easy to set up build, easy to gear. I quite enjoy it, and it's going to be one of the highest pushing builds next season, indeed. Alright, so let's move on to the next solo pushing build. This is a build that I tested out in 261 and have brought back for testing on the PTR with 264. I managed to clear a Grandeur of 119 on the PTR. However, that was at the 3,000 per stack PTR amount because Tal Rosh is getting reduced to, as compared on the PTR, down to 2,000% per stack. This will be about a 2 Grandeur Rift difference, so you should still be able to clear up to Grandeur of 117 at that 1600 Paragon or so mark. Around that level of power with full augmentations and all that, right? So still a very powerful build, and you may be asking why you would want to run this over Tal Meteor, since both builds are fairly attainable and fairly easy to put together and fairly easy to run. You may be wondering why. Well, my answer is, if you're a Frozen Orb enthusiast and you kind of want to push high earlier in season, this might be the build to look into first before DMO Frozen Orb, because DMO Frozen Orb, while insanely powerful, is very squishy. The defense of the build doesn't kick in until you get higher Paragon, higher augmentations, and the like, right? So it's a very tricky build to play and master. In addition to that, the DMO Frozen Orb is. So if you're looking for something that's maybe a little bit easier to play, but still a whole lot of fun, fairly powerful at slightly lower Paragon, so I'm thinking you might run this up to about 16 to 1800 Paragon, and then you may start looking into DMO Frozen Orb as a push build, right? DMO Frozen Orb uses the Aetherwalker. This build does not. Instead, we're using the Orb of Infinite Depth. So that's that extra layer of defense that's going to kick in here to let us clear easier even earlier in the season, right? So if you're in love with Frozen Orb, this will be a great setup. The cool thing about Tal Rosh Frozen Orb, and this is something that I've always wanted to do with DMO, but you can never do it because of the skill slot configuration, is that with Tal, we can actually fit in all three. We can fit in Teleport, we can fit in a pull from Black Hole Spellsteal, and we can also fit in the Explosive Blast for the Orb of Infinite Depth, so for that added tankiness, right? So this is a very solid setup. It's going to get you high into those, mid 110 Greater Rifts. Even earlier in season, I would think you could break a Greater Rift 110, so very appealing setup. Runs the Strong Arm Bracers in combination with the Black Hole, helps you pin those elites right where you want them. You can even teleport farther out if you need to, and just lay into them when that cold cycle comes around from your convention of elements, right? So do keep in mind there is some travel time with the frozen orbs, so start spamming your frozen orbs just slightly before that cold rotation if you want to get full benefit out of it. This is a slightly harder to gear setup as compared to Tal Meteor, because you will want to be focusing on area damage as well. So area damage and attack speed are going to be very important with this setup. That said, you could sort of balance the two, and there are a couple of different levels of attack speed and area damage that you can go for. I've even included a high paragon setup if you want to swap in that elemental exposure for whatever reason. But overall, I felt at the Paragon, 1600 Paragon with reasonable augmentations, I felt Blur was still the way to go. Especially because when you start ramping up the multiplier from Endless Walk, you lose the damage reduction from there, and this just helps you stand in the position you want to stand in for longer. Another difference as compared to DMO Frozen Orb, DMO Frozen Orb is mostly a trash focused build, a trash clearing build. Skips most elites in the Rift. This build can actually, this Tarasha's Frozen Orb can actually engage elites. It's more of a kiting playstyle, so less of a skipping ahead and grouping and demolishing and then moving on. You're actually sort of trying to pull trash around elites and then kite them into more trash and more elites, so you can deal more efficient damage with the pull and the area damage, right? So that's sort of what you're looking for here, just playstyle wise. Anyway, it's a very engaging setup. I hope you enjoy it, and yeah. Alright, so now the last solo pushing variation I'm going to cover is going to be the Vyr Deathwish Manal Reverse Archon setup. This setup, the general idea is you are empowering the build with an Archon, building up those Vyr stacks, those Archon stacks, and then once you get into non-Archon form, you will channel the Arcane Torrent. This will proc the paralysis on enemies, making them eligible for Manal heal. Damage. Manal heal damage will be dealt across a window of time, and within that window, the higher the tick rate of your, or rather the lower the tick rate of your skill, the higher the attack speed of your skill, the more instances of damage you will be able to deal within that window. So that's the idea. As you can tell, this being an Archon build, cooldown CDR will be very important. Attack speed will also be hugely important. That's why I am going the pig sticker in the main hand. This does make it a little bit difficult when pushing, or a little bit interesting when pushing. You're going to want to focus on those beast and human mob types, of course. So I'll get a little bit more into that later. But as you can see, we're running quad gloves with attack speed, cooldown on rings, attack speed on the weapon, of course, and then the base, we're also running attack speed on the amulet, just to hit certain breakpoints, and I will reference another video. I will keep it in the spreadsheet, and also I might post it in the description. It's a guide that I've done in a previous season where I go over the particular breakpoints that you'll want to look out for with this build in regards to beam stacking, and also the Manal Teal dynamic breakpoints that you can look out for as well. There's also a lot of playstyle suggestions in that particular guide, so if you want to look there a little bit deeper, I suggest you do. Anyway, the general idea here is that we're running the Crumbs buff bracer because we want to be able to stand and channel without interruption. So the vortex would be very disruptive here, knockback would be incredibly disruptive, so we're trying to nullify all of those type of effects and just allow us to stand and channel and deal our damage as much as possible. Because our damage window is so short, that's why we want to optimize our time outside of Archon to make sure it counts for as much as possible. We're also running the Black Hole this season, Spell Steal, giving a nice additive damage bonus when you hit more enemies. As you can see, the proc-based nature of this build is such that it's really more like a single target DPS, so closer to maybe Impale Demon Hunter than some other builds, but it also requires density to be able to deal its highest damage potential. So that's what you're gonna kind of want to look out for on an ultimate push. This build is very hard to gear, by the way, so if you're looking for a challenge to gear up in season, and also something that is incredibly fun to push, I love playing this build, so highly recommend it. Cool thing with the black hole, using the black hole this season, will be you're able to pull enemies together, which can help you dispense with trash, for instance, if you're unable to find an elite, but more importantly, it'll help you pull those yellows together. So if you get in the situation where you have multiple yellow elites, being able to pull them close together and deal simultaneous Manalt heal damage to both yellows is just super efficient with this build. So that's what we're going to want to try and do. It's also incredibly tanky, this build, highly defensive. We're running Halo of Carini in combination with the Orb of Infinite Depth. As you can see here, we also this season, for the Grandeur bonus, are able to run the Mantle of Channeling. So on the PTR, you might have seen a video I put out, I was actually running the Strong Arms variation. Running Mantle of Channeling should increase the damage slightly. I cleared a 119 on the PTR. Maybe playing with Mantle of Channeling would have allowed me to push a 120 at about 1600 Paragon with augmentations and all that. So something to look forward to in season, a Greater Rift 120 capable Vyr 6 build, right? So the circling back now to the impact that the beast and human damage of the pig sticker is going to have here. I do prefer this build as a melee setup. As such, I decided not to go to the Starfire. Starfire would be a slower attack speed as well, so it's just a clunkier build in my opinion, and very hard to gear for because it forces you to put attack speed on your rings, and it's just very difficult to gear for in my opinion. You get higher stack counts, higher damage, higher defense with the pig sticker. In my opinion, it's the better way to go. But as far as pushing, you're going to want to look for mob types that are beast and or human, elites that are beast and or human, rift guardians that are beast and or human. So your perfect rift is going to be very hard to come by with this build, especially because you're going to get different mob sets and different elite types on various floors, so it's very difficult to come across the perfect rift here. But that could also be a good thing for you. If you're looking for a challenge to gear, a challenge to push, have a lot of fun with, this is a super fun build in season and I highly recommend it. I have recommended life per hit. It is very nice for recovery in this build on the bracer at a minimum, but if you happen to get a weapon that has life on hit instead, you can run with that weapon and then put vitality on the bracer. This would make it a little bit more balanced. As you can see here, I've swapped in a little bit of Vite just to give, since it is a fairly low health pool, even though we have such high damage reduction, we have low health pool, you might want to swap in some Paragon to Vite or go with Amethyst. Alright, moving on, one last build here. This is going to be my attempt at a group build. So this is the Vyr MH Deathwish RGK, similar setup, it's a reverse Archon build. Except this focus is going to be Rift Guardian Killer. So the idea here was that, in my opinion, the Demon Hunter is going to be very strong next season, being a single target DPS that has very high upfront damage, but Demon Hunter can't really stack Stricken very efficiently, and I kind of feel that Wizard, even though we similarly have issues with desync, when it comes to stacking Stricken, we at least can hit the 5 APS cap and stack Stricken extremely quickly here. So this was my attempt at that sort of build. If you want to look over it, maybe make some modifications for yourself, test it out in season, do whatever you want to do. The idea here was just gear for slightly higher attack speed, and then you run the Leoric's Crown in the cube to be able to allow you to reset Archon a little bit more timely manner, a little bit quicker, so that you could have double stack Swami overlap. That was the big thing. And the idea was you line up this double stack Swami overlap at the same time your convention of elements comes around to lightning, right? So that would boost your damage in that 4 seconds of time. 4 seconds every Archon, you get max damage, right? And then it would deal huge damage to the Rift Guardian, and you'd continue to stack Stricken at an insane pace, right? So that's the idea, at least, and if you want to play around with it, good. If not, that's cool. Alright, so I believe we've covered all the wizard builds. Hope you enjoy these builds and are able to use them in Season. I know I am. So, Season 16 with the Grandeur bonus is definitely going to be one. It's interesting. It's going to introduce a lot of new configurations that we can run with and enjoy and test out. So, in the very least, it's going to shake things up a little bit and going to be a very enjoyable season, I think. So, along with the 6-piece damage increases, it's going to be quite nice, quite an adventure, I'm hoping. Anyways, stick around. Keep an eye out, rather. I may be putting together some other videos for these other classes that I will be running in season. And yeah, thank you for hanging out, and I will catch you in the grid.